Welcome to Science Symposium 2019. We're here at 533 Diversey at the Urantia Foundation. And our third speaker is my good friend Bruce Johnson. Bruce entered college in 1966 as a physics major, but he graduated in 1970 with a BA in psychology. Being a bit anti-establishment and part hippie, he then moved to a rustic log cabin in the foothills of Colorado. During his 20s, he was self-employed, doing local backhoe excavating. More importantly, he became a budding Urantia book enthusiast. Middle life included a move to Denver for 25 years and an RN degree with work in adolescent psychiatric nursing. Finding inspiration in Jungian psychology. He became active in a weekly Jungian group for 10 years. In 2006, Bruce retired to Ithaca, New York, where he was fortunate enough to find Betty and Ralph Zer's inspiring Urantia book study group, and we were fortunate enough to find him. Bruce currently enjoys assisting burials at a natural burial cemetery, fixing broken items at a weekly Ithaca Fixers Collective, and facilitating classes with the Urantia Book Internet School, as well as serving on its board of directors. It's my pleasure to present Bruce Johnson to you.
Thank you, Ralph. Thanks. It's wonderful to be here. It really is. As you know, I've been interested in human behavior and different ways of looking at it through most of my life. But it's only in the last handful of years that I really took what the Urantia book has to say about mind and the 7 adjutant mind spirits, that I brought it into my more seriously to study that as an explanation, as a source of our mind, and I'm just starting to appreciate it more. The talk today, the last symposium 3 years ago was, I talked about the 7 adjutant mind spirits, and today I want to talk about, the title is The Renaissance of Consciousness. There's a lot of studying going on now, a resurgence in the mystery, trying to solve the mystery of consciousness with all the added science and whatnot. So there's still mystery involved in consciousness. It's a wide topic. I want to talk about a few things that are of interest to me, some specifics, and we're going to approach it in 3 parts. The first part goes back almost 100 years ago to 2 of the pioneers in psychotherapy and in prominent people in the earlier days of psychology, what they had to say about consciousness. And then the middle part is around 1955 when the Urantia book came out. It turns out it has some very specific descriptions. It reveals some things about things like self-consciousness in a different way than we typically think of it. So we're going to look at some Urantia book terms in the middle part. For an example on self-conscious, I could say I'm self-conscious right now, and you go, oh, I know what you mean, Bruce. I mean, I'm nervous, is one way to look at it. But the Urantia book has another way a specific way that's quite interesting I want to share with you about, another way to look at the term self-conscious and some other terms. The middle part, Urantia book terms. And then the last part was added on while I was researching the first 2 parts. And it's there's a bestseller book out in the last couple of years called How to Change Your Mind. And I thought, well, maybe I should research and read about that in preparing to talk about consciousness. And that's about a resurgence in serious studying going on now on 2 psychedelics, which is psilocybin and LSD, which turns out during this past 100 years, there was a time in the 50s where there was a lot of active, serious study on these interesting drugs. So the 3 parts. We'll start with the first one, 2 pioneers. back in the field. And the first one of them is Carl Jung, but the first one I want to talk about is Dr. William S. Sadler, whose room we're in. And we know he's connected to the Urantia book, and then he was a psychiatrist, but I didn't realize how prominent he was in his field. He wrote a total of 42 books. Most of them have to do with mental health. And I happened to pick up one of his books several years back called The Mind at Mischief. And it's subtitled, Tricks and Deceptions of the Subconscious and How to Cope with Them. So I thought, well, I'll see what Dr. Sadler has to say on the topic of consciousness, that maybe we can get a snapshot of thinking back then. So a little closer look at Dr. Sadler's, some stuff out of his book written in 1929, which the forum studies were well underway by 1929. And I thought, oh, it'll be interesting to see what Dr. Sadler has to say about a mind or something, because it's mentioned in the Urantia book. But of course, he doesn't talk about the 7 adjective mind spirits or anything in this book. That's not what it's about. What this book is about, though, is during the 1920s especially, there's a lot of cultural interest in things called seances and mediumship spiritualism, they called it. Spiritualism was a big thing, and it turns out that Dr. Sadler was one of the leading skeptics about mediumship and spiritualism, and a big part of this book is devoted to that. I would say he mentions maybe 30 different times where he had sat in on a seance, and he's describing what kind of natural subconscious occurrences are going on here. We're not really reaching beyond the grave to people, voices from the dead, that kind of spirits. So a lot of the book is spent on that we're not capable of reaching beyond the grave, so to speak. But he does have a couple things to say about consciousness, and I'll just pass them on to you, and spirit. On consciousness, he says, man has a single mind, but he has a dual consciousness. And this dual consciousness is a central and a marginal consciousness. And the marginal consciousness is what they called back then the subconscious, was just part of the psychology. He says this dual consciousness is never separated by hard and fast lines. So there's some transference between the subconscious and what he calls the marginal consciousness. So that's 20. The other thing I wanted to mention is he talks about what spirit is. The book is talking about spiritualism, which he says that's the mediums and the seances and stuff. He says those are psychic projections, fanatic creations of the subconscious mind. They come from within a person's mind, not from beyond the grave. But he does say, I want to qualify another definition of spirit besides, and he says that's the theological sense of spirit. And just what he says about that, his definition, he says that's a non-material entity. It's united, that is limited in its contact with the human mind to the making of spiritual suggestions and to communicating with the spiritual monitors which are assumed to dwell in the human mind. So as a Urantia book reader, I thought, that captures an inner spirit that he's talking about, and I was pleased to see that. And he does say that the proof of the existence of these spiritual monitors must ever be without the pale of science. Their recognition is wholly a matter of belief. So that's a couple things that it's really a good book. Has a lot about mental health treatment, but I wanted to share those two thoughts with you from Dr. Sadler. Thank you, Dr. Sadler. And if you get a chance to read any of his books, I feel closer to Dr. Sadler after reading all his stories, things like that. So 42 books I don't know how he did that. A little bit from Carl Jung. It turns out they were both born in 1875, Carl Jung and Dr. Sadler. They were both very prominent in the field of psychology early on. So with Jung, the way I see him as an individual that was in pretty good contact with his thought adjuster. He's trying to explain his own spiritual growth to his cohorts in the field of psychology through psychology terms. But there's a real spiritual nature to Carl Jung's work. And there's a lot of groups out there that study Jung, and I think they get spiritually uplifted by him. For today's thing on consciousness, I wanted to share just 4 features of Jungian psychology with you that I think kind of, they're interconnected, but they have to do with consciousness and beyond. And the first one is called individuation. And individuation is a lifelong psychological process of differentiation of the self out of your individual conscious and unconscious elements. Individuation is the main task of human development. So that's central to Jungian processes, this thing of individuation. Of the 4 things, there's a second thing is called active imagination, and this is closely tied to individuation. So the term active imagination is a process in Jungian psychology used to bridge the gap between the conscious and the unconscious mind. And active imagination is where you hear about it in psychotherapy a lot, about trying to unravel the symbolic meaning of things that have happened in your life lately. In Jungian, well, anyways, it's trying to imagine spiritual intent, in a sense, behind everyday things or things that are recurring in your life. It's a broad term. The third term is called the collective unconscious that Jung talks about. And in 1936, here's what in a lecture he talks about this. He says, "My thesis then on the collective unconscious is, in addition to our immediate consciousness, which is of a thoroughly personal nature, there exists a second psychic system of a collective, universal, and impersonal nature, which is identical in all individuals. This collective conscious, does not develop individually, but is inherited. And it can only become conscious secondarily, and given you can't directly connect to it. Secondarily, that's where the active imagination, and that's, in a sense, we're talking about spiritual growth. Well, but no, we're not talking exactly about that. Let me do the 4th term before we'll put them together. The last Jungian term is called the self with a capital S. And Jung, being in psychology, didn't talk about God very much, but he did have this term he called the self. So the self in Jungian psychology signifies the unification of the consciousness and the unconscious, and it represents the psyche as a whole. So these 4 processes to goal, that's what Jungian psychotherapy is about, is unifying this vast body of knowledge out there. And as Urantia book readers, we talk about spiritual growth all the time. I think that Jungians are doing probably a fair job of growing their spirits through this kind of process, even without the Urantia book. But that's the way we're designed. That's what we're supposed to be doing. Okay, that's enough for two pioneers nearly 100 years ago. But those were novel thoughts back then, the unconscious, collective unconscious. Freud talked about the personal unconscious, but Jung brought about the collective unconscious, which is something much bigger than just your personal memories and things that are repressed. So just a quick note, in the last, say, 25 years, the mystery of consciousness has gotten quite a bit more attention. And one example is called the Science of Consciousness International Conferences for the past 26 years. It's a pretty popular conference, interdisciplinary, where they're trying to unravel the mystery of consciousness. And they're the first to say we're not there yet. We don't understand it all. But if they're open to the biology and the new science, to philosophy, to meditation, all kinds of people are getting together for several days each year to try to unravel the mystery of consciousness. So there's some exciting stuff on that. And it turns out the third part, I'm going to mention an author, Michael Pollan, who has a book that I want to talk about. Turns out he's going to be the keynote speaker next April for the Science of Consciousness Conference in Arizona. Maybe I'll go, because well, anyway, so don't want to get ahead of myself. That's the end of part one. Part two is where we talk about Urantia book terms. And I want to, we've heard about the superconscious and things like that, but I'll go just through a couple examples of some terms. And one that I find interesting is the repeated term of self-conscious with a dash between it. If I do a word search in Urantia book of self-conscious, like if I'm, in front of crowds, I'm self-conscious or something, you won't find that in the Urantia book. But if you put a dash in there, the self-conscious shows up quite a bit. And let me give you just a few examples to help you understand the Urantia book version of this. Starting with when he was being counseled by Emmanuel for his seventh bestowal, here's a part of what Emmanuel says. I offer you the following counsel, which should guide you in the living of your earth life as you become progressively self-conscious regarding the divine mission of your sojourn in the flesh. So a little bit of that might ring true to us as individuals too. Becoming progressively self-conscious. So when Jesus was a teenager, I used to work with teenagers quite a bit, and they're in this fluid state of just starting to become self-reflective in a sense. They're on automatic pilot a lot of the time when they're 12. Maybe by the time they're 15, they start to have inner thinking about why they do what they do. So on Jesus's, there's a paper called 2 Crucial Years about ages 14 and 15, and I want to share this beginning of the paper. Of all Jesus's earth life experiences, the 14th and 15th years were the most crucial. These 2 years after he began to be self-conscious of divinity and destiny, but before he achieved a large measure of communication with his indwelling adjusters, those 2 years were the most trying of his eventful life on Urantia. So it's not easy when you are partway there. But self-consciousness, it's a progressive stage. And to me, that shows that this is, for each one of us, it can be tricky. He explains another way to look at self-consciousness that I've been intrigued about, and that's to distinguish between animal consciousness and human consciousness. So just to throw another quote at you, when he's talking to Gannett, he says, I have told you much about the mind of man and the divine spirit that lives within. But now, let me emphasize that self-consciousness is a reality. When any animal becomes self-conscious, it becomes a primitive man. It says, no mere animal, animals do possess coordination of associated sensations, memory, but animals do not have a meaningful recognition or a purposeful association of these combined physical experiences as is manifested in the conclusions of intelligent and reflective human interpretations. This fact of self-conscious existence associated with the reality of subsequent spiritual experience constitutes man a potential son of the universe. So, self-consciousness, spiritual direction. One more about where our consciousness lies. Human consciousness rests gently upon the electrochemical mechanism below the brain and delicately touches the spiritual Urantia energy system above. Neither of these two systems is a human being ever completely conscious in his mortal life. Therefore must he work in mind, of which he is conscious. So these things are, we live in our minds and we don't think about it much. We take it all for granted, but there's a purpose for our minds. To switch to a couple other related terms in the Urantia book that got my attention the last couple years. One related, it's the terms capacity and reception. We're mortal humans, evolutionary humans. and there's some interesting information about our circumstances when you consider capacity and reception, and I want to share a couple of quotes that I find interesting. In paper 49, they talk about brain type series among mortals of different planets. It says, among all the planets, it says, the physical uniformity of mortals is the brain and nervous system. Brains are, other mortals and other planets have brains. Urantians are the two-brain type, somewhat more imaginative, adventurous, and philosophical than the one brain. So we should be happy we got two brains, I guess. But somewhat less spiritual, ethical, and worshipful than the three-brain ones. So that's our lot in life. We're in between. That's okay. And it mentions that planets, if you're lucky enough to be in the third brain category, that one of the functions of that third brain aspect is the spiritual counterparting activities of the thought adjuster. So brains on some planets, it's a more fluid communication, I think, with the thought adjusters. We have to struggle with it more on our planet because we're the two-brain type. Similarly, they talk about what they call, among mortals, spirit reception series. And they say that this does not refer to the 1, 2, or 3 brain, but it refers primarily to gland chemistry, more particularly to the organization of certain glands comparable to the pituitary bodies. Some worlds have 1 gland. Others have 2 as Urantians, while others have 3 of these unique bodies. The inherent imagination and spiritual receptivity is definitely influenced by this differential chemical endowment. That's interesting. And related to that receptivity and capacity, I wanted to share with you from one of the thought adjuster papers where they talk about the selection and assignment of what's important to a thought adjuster when they volunteer for each one of us. And there they say the thought adjuster is interested in 3 qualifications of the individual, the candidate. First is the intellectual capacity. Is the mind normal? Will wisdom have an opportunity to function? That's important to the thought adjuster. 2 is spiritual perception. What is the potential of the soul and probable spiritual capacity of receptivity? So apparently we are matched up concerning this, hard for us to measure, but it's out there, a spiritual capacity and receptivity. That's interesting. And the third thing the thought adjuster looks at is the combined intellectual and spiritual powers, combined 1 and 2. To what degree can these two endowments may possibly be associated and combined? So the thought adjusters use that quality in us, which is known apparently by the age of 6 or something. And it does mention that the thought adjusters aren't concerned with whether we're male or female in choosing us. They're more concerned with our spiritual capacity and receptivity. So it's that's FYI. The other thing in the Urantia book that's related to consciousness in a sense is a thing called creative imagination. And with the Jungian studies, we were always talking about active imagination. That's the way that you make your unconscious conscious, is through active imagination. It's a way to that barrier, to get some transference between the barriers. So when I see the term creative imagination, it's used together a number of times in the Urantia book, and I want to share some meanings about that Urantia book style. In paper 9, it says first source and third source personalities. We're a first source personality. We're endowed with minds, embracing, and they mention about 7 things. We're all endowed with minds embracing memory, reason, judgment, creative imagination, idea association, decision, and choice. Right in the middle of that is something they term creative imagination. Oh, that stirs my imagination a little bit in a sense. Here's some examples of to help me think about what this concept of creative imagination is from the Urantia book. About the time primitive man is developing a simple language is the beginning of the exercise of creative imagination. Language is an exercise of creative imagination. It makes sense. Children, when first learning to make sense of language, are prone to think out loud, to express their thoughts in words, even if no one's present to hear them. With the dawn of creative imagination, they evince a tendency to converse with imaginary companions. So we've seen that in children. But to me, that's an exercise of a capacity of your consciousness, of your mind, to imagine something beyond. And we take little steps to get where we're going to eventually go. But I liked that. Another, what helps me understand creative imagination too is the idea of pondering. And I noticed the Urantia book uses pondering a number of times. And I've started using it in UBIS classes. I say, should we ponder this a little bit? To me, that's another way of activating your creative imagination. And they even a mighty messenger in a quote says something, we ponder about some big thing. So this idea of the gift of imagination and the purpose of it, to think about the purpose. It's not just to imagine inventing the wheel or something, or how to do better at your job, but there's, combined with a spiritual surge, it's a powerful tool. So that's some Urantia book terms that are more specific than just that I feel self-conscious here or something. When you think of self-consciousness, it takes on a richer meaning, I think. So, while reading Dr. Sadler's book, The Mind of Mischief, with a cool subtitle, I came across a good review of a book from 2018, I think, called How to Change Your Mind. And it has the subtitle, which is kind of thought-provoking. It says, what the new science of psychedelics teaches us about consciousness, dying, addiction, depression, and transcendence. Those are all key, hit my buttons kind of words. So it turns out it's on the bestsellers list. Michael Pollan is familiar to some people. He's written a lot of books, mostly to do with food. He's a journalist, and he's 7 books have been on the bestsellers list. Time magazine felt he was one of the top 100 most influential people on the planet. So here's this book, and once I started reading it, after about half an hour, I said, he's trying to give a new look to this, what consciousness is, and the ranges of consciousness. So I want to just share a little bit of Michael Pollan's research, basically. And the book is about specifically psilocybin and LSD research, and some kind of startling results from research back in the 50s, and now it's in the last 10 to 15 years there's been some renewed research and some startling results. Michael Pollan comes from a non-spiritual background. He says, I don't know if I've ever had a spiritual experience. And he's never taken hallucinogenics when he takes on the project of exploring this. And the reason why he started exploring it was he'd had tucked away in his drawer some information somebody had sent him that they thought he might be interested in. And what he pulled out of his drawer after he had been at a party and someone talked about they had taken LSD recently. And he thought, I didn't think people were engaged in that anymore. He said, I think I got a paper back in my drawer. Anyways, this paper was on a study done in 2006 on psilocybin. And psilocybin and LSD, we'll talk about them in a minute, are very similar in chemical makeup. They're both, well, we'll get into that in a minute. But this test was the first one in 40 years of a rigorously designed, double-blind, placebo-controlled clinical study. First done in 40 years on psilocybin. And what was remarkable is that it was only 30 people in it. But they had some interesting responses to the one controlled, and it's important to know these are controlled experiences with conditions that are, it's not like recreational use of drugs or something. But the participants said that this one experience was, a lot of them said it was one of the most meaningful experiences of their lives, comparable to the birth of a child. 2/3 of the participants rated the session among the top 5 most spiritually significant experiences of their lives. 1/3 said it was the most such experience in their lives. So Michael Pollan says, well, I'm going to try to study more on this curious thing going on there. So he goes, here's a few things from his book to give you an idea of what it's about. He says, I was curious to learn what the chemistry involved was in this. How do you get from the ingestion of a compound created by a fungus to a novel state of consciousness with the power to change one's perspective on things? And the perspective has changed not just during the journey, but long after the molecule has left the body. And these are small molecules, but it says the molecules are tryptamines. It's a type of organic compound distinguished by the presence of 2 linked rings, the molecule is. One ring has 6 atoms, the other's 5 atoms. And nature is awash in tryptamines. It's in plants, they're in plants, fungi, and animals. They typically act as signaling molecules between cells. The one that is most recognized is the neurotransmitter serotonin is a tryptamine. The chemical makeup is very close to these drugs that we're talking about. So further in his research, he looks into the history. He interviews probably 30 people that have been involved in the new experiments and the older experiments and stuff. But in uncovering the history, he says, he finds that beginning in the early 50s, psychedelics had been used to treat a whole host of conditions, including addiction, depression, obsessive compulsive disorder, schizophrenia, autism, and end-of-life anxiety. There had been 40,000 research participants in more than 1,000 clinical papers. This was during the 50s. Even the American Psychiatric Association had a whole meeting, several meetings centered around LSD, the new wonder drug. But by the mid-60s, the controversy over these drugs that nobody quite understood got so bad that they were banned and research dried up. Until the last 15 years or so, there's been some, even 10 years, there's been some encouraged and funded research going on. When you think of psychedelics, a banned drug and all that, and he distinguishes the difference, one notable difference between drugs of abuse. There's no toxicity with, you can't overdose from psychedelics. They won't kill you. Like a heroin overdose or things like that. That doesn't happen with these, even if you overdosed on LSD. And they don't have potential for addiction. If anything, the effects, if you say, gee, I had a great LSD trip or mushrooms or something, I want to do that again, you won't get the even the effect that you had. It's the opposite of addictive in a sense. Maybe if you waited a year or something, you might get another boost. But it's important to know that they're not addictive. He, besides, most of the book is objective science research, talking to people and stuff, but he ends up trying through controlled situations, psilocybin and LSD a handful of times to do his own documentation on it. And so he gives a little personal kind of views on what it is. And this helps me kind of understand what the experience might be like for him. He says, on my psychedelic journeys have taught me a great many interesting things. Many of these were the kinds of things one might learn in the course of psychotherapy. Insights into important relationships, the outlines of fears and desires ordinarily kept out of view, repressed memories and emotions, and perhaps most interesting and useful, a new perspective on how one's mind works. This, I think, is the great value of exploring non-ordinary states of consciousness. The light they reflect back on the ordinary ones, which seem to, then the ordinary ones seem to be not quite so ordinary or transparent. That's one way he puts it. This is nothing Freud or any number of psychologists haven't told us about. But the idea of normal, so-called normal consciousness, is but a tip of a large and largely uncharted psychic iceberg. Now for me, that's something more than a theory. The vastness of the mind is a felt reality. I don't mean to suggest I achieved a state of ego transcendence, but I tasted something. The experiences don't last, at least they didn't for me. He says, I found myself thinking about things like death and time and infinity, but less in angst and more in wonder. He is an expert on plants, and he relates to the plant world more as being more lively through some of his experiences. I want to skip over. There was a episode where he had an experience of a growing plant helped him see how to escape a cage. And that really resonated with me. And after I read it about 4 or 5 times, I thought, Bruce, the reason that resonates with you is because I was in traction for 3 months and a body cast for a month when I was a teenager. And the idea of being trapped, as he had in his imagination, and seeing a way out slowly happening, it resonated for me. But that's was just me. He goes on and says that experience where he felt a vine growing towards the light was his trying to tell him something, that there's a way out of a cage that you feel. It's in his book. His book, by the way, is available free. It's online as a PDF now. So he says that experience of seeing an uncageable vine reminded me of the first psilocybin trip, when I felt that the leaves and plants in the garden were returning my gaze. He said, one of the gifts of psychedelics is the way they reanimate the world as if they were distributing the blessings of consciousness more widely and evenly over the landscape. In the process, breaking the human monopoly on subjectivity that we moderns take as a given. To us, we are the world's only conscious subjects, with the rest of creation made up of objects. To the more egotistical among us, even other people can count as objects. But psychedelic consciousness overturns that view by granting us a wider, more generous lens through which we can glimpse the subjecthood, and he calls it the spirit of everything, animal, vegetable, even mineral. And right towards the end of the book, there's just a little bit more which sort of sums his he says, forget about psychedelics for a minute. And he wants to bring in quantum mechanics. He says, quantum mechanics holds that matter may not be as innocent of mind as a materialist would have us believe. For example, subatomic particles can exist simultaneously in multiple locations. It's possible until it is measured and thus perceived by mind. I'm not an expert on quantum mechanics, but the mind, the observer, there's this mystery that the observer affects the outcome. So, needless to say, this raises some tricky questions for a materialist understanding of consciousness. And the thrust of this is what we mentioned before. Can you describe, can a materialist describe the source of consciousness as only material if you can see that it's affecting things at the lowest level? And he says, the ground underfoot may be less solid than we think. He says, about quantum physics, he says, I mention it only because it lends some of the authority of science to speculations that would otherwise sound utterly lunatic. In his ending, he says, I still tend to think that consciousness must be confined to brains, but I'm less certain of this belief now than when I was before I embarked on the journey. Mysteries abide, but this I can say with certainty. The mind is vaster, the world ever so much more alive than I knew when I began. And that's the end of his book. I want to leave you with a parting message from a philosopher his name was Alan Watts, popular in the 50s and 60s. And he says, if you get the message, hang up the phone. For psychedelic drugs are simply instruments like microscopes, telescopes, or a telephone. The biologist doesn't sit with eye permanently glued to the microscope. He goes away and works on what he has seen. I like that quote. So there's some thoughts on what potentially the title of Renaissance in Consciousness, starting with Freud and Jung and Dr. Sadler. Maybe I'm encouraged that at least there's more interest in trying to understand it, and some novel approaches are getting explored. I'm not recommending the novel approaches, but to at least do research on them, and maybe they can give us some keys. So that's what I wanted to say about consciousness, and I look forward to a discussion. If you have if one or two things piqued your interest, that would be great. But let me get a chair. Thank you.